Hey, welcome to Afterlife Topics and Metaphysics. This is Cyrus, and I'm here with the great JURGEN ZIEWE here in Worthing, UK, at his house. And pretty awesome to be here and with a legend at his place, and it's a real honor. So we're going to have a chat and talk about some cool stuff we've been up to. How you doing, JURGEN?
Yeah, very well. Thanks for coming here. It was great to finally meet you in person, which was good. The good thing about this series and myself is that our experiences are very congruent, aren't they? And we tend to sort of bounce off on each other and confirm our experience, and therefore I think we're creating a much better picture of the afterlife reality, which we sort of both experience via out-of-body experiences. So.
Yeah, exactly. So there's been a couple of interviews floating around that we've done together, at least one I think where we have chatted, and also at the Afterlife Symposium. You had a virtual presentation that time to an audience, and then I actually came on stage. It was before you, I believe.
Yeah.
But that was also kind of a tandem thing. So we've done a couple tandem things in the past, but what's great is that, as you know, on this channel we talk about out-of-body experiences, astral projection, life after death, all of these kinds of things. And so if you're new around here, that's what we talk about. Jurgen's the author of Multidimensional Man, Vistas of Infinity, and the 10-Minute Moment. And very prominent, very well known in this area. And so I often reference Jurgen's work because what we talk about on Afterlife Topics is trying to get into the kind of the nuts and bolts, the accurate information about what basically, you know, how the whole multidimensional thing works, where we go, where our consciousness goes. And I know this provides a lot of comfort to people who are still caught up in the spell of materialism, who think that we're just made of meat and we go back to the ground and that's all there is, you know. So there's a lot of stuff I could ask you, but I do have a question that's popped into my mind, and it's that here in the UK, where you live, and how long have you been living here?
Since 1975.
Oh my! And how long have you had this beautiful house?
Oh, this one only about 14 years.
Okay.
14 years, yeah.
So living in the UK, do you notice that there is a lot of kind of like hard-boiled English materialism? People don't want any of this spiritual mumbo-jumbo, or do you notice is it more open-minded?
Well, it's difficult to say really, but I noticed that over the last sort of 10 years at least, you know, the mind sort of opened a bit more. But when I came to England, of course, I found there was a lot more written material about spiritualism than there was in Germany. You know, so that points to the fact that England has always been a little bit more open, perhaps, than Germany. In Germany, so in the last few years, it has opened up a little bit more. You know, but I kept all my experiences secret until 2008 because I didn't want to come across as a lunatic. Because most people wouldn't buy the stuff, even friends. You know, they thought, oh, it's just Jürgen dreaming. You know, he's been dreaming.
Right, and isn't that an issue a lot of people have when they think that they will be perceived this way or they'll get that criticism? And this keeps a lot of people from going public about their spiritual experiences, their out-of-body experiences. Something that I have noticed is a lot of people have these experiences, but they're afraid to share them. So like the work that I do, or Afterlife Topics, or the community, is that it gives a way for people to talk about these things. So I do want to, I assume a lot of people watching know who you are, but maybe just real quick, you could talk a little bit about how long you've been having out-of-body experiences, and basically like a little bit about your first book, Multidimensional Man.
Yes, I mean, it first started, it was initiated by profound sort of spiritual experiences which came out of my few years of meditation practice. And this spiritual experience triggered because during this experience I had a depersonalization. I suddenly realized that I was not just my physical body, and that seemed to have opened up my mind And sure enough, shortly after that, I had my first out-of-body experience, but I had no idea what was going on. So I then went through a period where I tried to educate myself of what has happened. And once I pegged it, that what was really happening, I started deliberately sort of pursuing the out-of-body experience. And that went on regularly, several times a week, which I then started recording and chronicling, you know. And then I also found other books, like Robert Monroe's book, and that confirmed to me, that was confirmation that there was a real thing and worth pursuing, really.
And so one of the great things is there's a lot of cross-corroboration, so I kind of want to jump into a few interesting territories, because I also want to provide some new stuff for people watching. We can kind of to wrap our minds around or eat up.
Okay.
And something I find really interesting is the concept of, well, first of all, for people maybe who have, for example, read my book or read one of Jurgen's books, there is kind of this place that I like to call the second version of this planet. And of course, there's many layers that we can go into, but just generally speaking, that, for example, when I'm having an out-of-body experience, when I am astral projecting, I will often be in a counterpart of the environment that I'm in normally, which is sometimes even a similar place of operations. Like if I'm in a hotel, I might find it's still a hotel, but there might be different management and a different thing going on, but it's still the building is sort of being used in the same way, at least in this kind of near Earth astral condition. So real quick, do you have any experiences, for example, here we're pretty close to Brighton, like Astral Brighton, I think you've mentioned.
Yes, and it's so similar. The experiences I had here locally, they were so similar, and other places where I lived and had out-of-body experience, that I wasn't able to tell whether it was physical or astral. In fact, I had to really concentrate very hard, because the first thing I felt, I had to make sure that I wasn't there physical. Okay, it was so real, so identical to the physical. So I invented the hover test, you know, which was basically, if I could lift up in the air and stay there, then I knew this was an astral experience. And that is actually how similar these two states can be, that it takes you some time to convince yourself whether you're out of body or not. Do you find that? Yeah,
and also there's the third test to see if it's astral or a dream state. This is something Bullman was doing as well, wasn't it, with seeing if you can change like the paint on a wall or something along those lines.
That's right.
Because then there's the third factor is it a dream, or is it an objective, or we could call it not a consensus environment, right? So that's a place that is shared by, like this world is a consensus reality, right? Or is it consensus? Yes. Because it is shared by millions of souls. A dream might just be, you know, one person, one soul that's creating it. Does that make sense, or is that right?
Yes, a dream. There's interesting work being done with regard to this. Dream consciousness is subjective, but of course it doesn't necessarily have to be subjective, because some people I know, like Ed Kellogg and Robert Wagner, they actually conducted experiments where they meet people in lucid dreams, so they're actually entering the dream environment, you know, and I'm only just read about it, you know. I always thought, okay, if people meet out of body, they are then meet in a consensus reality, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, you know. And I was really quite surprised that you can actually enter somebody's fantasy, if you like. You know, and that's really quite.
So what I came to find, or what I think from talking to people in my experiences, is that people go into these fantasies as like a hobby. So they want to create an environment, and so it's a bit like the film Inception. You've seen Inception, right? So on that side, people have the normal mental ability, I think, to create those. I think subjective is a good term to use, but it's like, I also call it a demi-plane sometimes. So it's not a full plane of existence. It's one that you've there's a bit more like the Star Trek holodeck.
Yes.
And so in this sense, people can then create the environment and then go in and meet together. And this may also relate sometimes to how our deceased loved ones communicate to us. They may create a dream and meet you in that dream.
Yes.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that this is the astral environment.
No.
So I mean, if you're with your uncle and you're fighting Godzilla, it doesn't mean that there's a Godzilla problem on the astral plane, does it? It means that it means that they made a fun scenario for you to enjoy. And then you're there, but it still feels like it's your uncle. It doesn't mean that you created him. It means that you're sharing a dream.
Yes, that's it. That's interesting. The one thing I always want to make sure when I have an out-of-body experience, that I'm in a consensus environment, that there is no dream narrative running along. You know, is that I try to dismantle the dream narrative. And the way I do that is as soon as I become lucid, I look either at my hands or I focus on the ground. I pick up a bit of grass and study it until it becomes crystal clear, and then the here and now reality emerges, and anything that was lucid dream content or dream narrative, that just sort of evaporates, that falls away, and then I'm in a here and now reality which is just as physical as this one, and then I know I'm in an astral level. And then I start sort of
so basically it's the same thing when I am also projecting. You have to make sure that there's you're distinguishing between those states. You don't want to be in a subjective dream and then interpreting this as a shared reality. But something interesting is that when somebody is on that side and they're a dreamer, it's almost like they're sleepwalking or having hallucinations. Is that something that you experience?
Absolutely. I find, for example, people, dreamers, they look like you find daydreamers in this reality. They're slightly sort of absent-minded. Do you find that?
It's a lot like if you know somebody who's in and out of sleep and they are babbling to themselves and it doesn't make a lot of sense. It seems to be the same phenomenon, except now it's people wandering around like this. So is this something people on this earth astral level, this kind of middle astral plane that people experience as sleepwalkers and people just babbling to themselves? It seems like it might be a bit weird. Yeah,
I think that's a curious thing, really, because I found when I go into an astral equivalent of let's say London or a big town, there's a lot of activity, it's a hive of activity, and I find that dreamers who populate the town of London, let's say they're asleep and they're populating it, to them it's all real, they're acting out as if they're real, and so I have actually interacted with people on a bus, who were having an argument, and I knew they were actually sleepers, the dreamers, but they were awake without being actually lucidly awake. But their astral environment had become their dream environment to them, so they acting quite normally. But on the other hand, I've also found that people who are not in an interaction, they are sort of seem to be in a dream state, like a kind of trance. And I think what is happening here is that they are processing their own dream content, which they are carrying with them on the astral plane. So they're not clear about where they are. They're just living in their projected world, their dream world with their fantasies, which may be superimposed
on top of
the astral.
But for, let's say, somebody who's not a dreamer, let's say somebody who is crossed over and lives on that side, and they're interacting with people who are dreaming, this must get a bit frustrating, I bet, because you're talking like somebody's in their own world or in their own mind, and they're like a sleepwalker. And they're just kind of going, they like, imagine we're in your garden, somebody walks by talking to himself. Well, it's a bit like, maybe like we see sometimes people here who are, have mental health issues and they might be talking to themselves. Do you think it's like that?
Well, I think what is happening when people interact, for example, I've been to to parties with my family who are still alive.
Yeah.
Okay, and I talk to them. To them, they probably don't even remember it, because most dreams are almost switched off the moment people wake up. So so if I were to talk to them and say, "Oh, do you remember last night we met at this party with our parents," and things like that, they may not even know about it.
Well, there's another aspect of this as well, which is that there can be sort of what I call an astral parallel self, or which you could also say is part of your higher self, which could have a life on that side that has full memory. When on that side, not in a dream state, but we don't carry that back with us.
Yes.
So I can meet living people here who are living on that side, and they have a whole life, and it's not a dream, it's not something that they're hallucinating, but they're fully conscious, they have a life, but they also have a part of their consciousness here, and when they're here they don't remember it, but on that side they have full memory of the life here. So it's weird, anything like this.
I think going back to the party I had with my living brothers and my dead parents and grandmother, we had this very beautiful, profound party. My take on this was that they interacted freely as from the higher self point, self-identification with the dead relatives, without them realizing consciously that they were interacting with their dead relatives, because that reality level was totally real. Okay, so they were not dreaming. The moment interaction takes place between the living and the dead, let's say, there's a conscious awareness of it. But they're not aware necessarily that they have got a body which is asleep in bed, which is the case. People like us, when we have an out-of-body experience, we know very well that we are asleep, that we are conscious here. That's the main difference, I think.
It is, well, what I wrote in my books is that for me it can be like I have a parallel life happening. When I'm projecting, suddenly I'm conscious of being me and that parallel life at the same time. And as a result, for people I'm with, it can be jarring, because it's like my consciousness swaps between myself here and this parallel self. So I could be engaged in an activity on the astral side when suddenly I become aware of myself as me from this world, and I actually forget what I'm doing, because I'm like, why am I holding this spatula or something, because suddenly I'm conscious of this version of me, and I forget who this person is next to me. The person next to me will say, "Oh, you astral projecting again, Cyrus, you forgot who I was." So this was a really weird discovery when I put those pieces together.
Yes, it can be very, very confusing, because I had an experience not so long ago where I was becoming conscious on the astral level as I was walking through a door and into a corridor. That was the first time I became conscious that I was in an out-of-body state. But then I met a group of people who I was actually teaching, and they have been in my class way before I became conscious of being there. And so the thing is that we do lead double lives, of which we are not normally aware, and then we can have the crossover point where we suddenly become aware of our double life during an out-of-body state, and then everything makes sense. We know the people, and everything makes sense.
And then you can bring back the memory of this parallel life. And presumably when you die, then you get the full memory back of this other life you've been having. Now, some people have wondered, then why do people have welcoming parties when people die? When people have near-death experiences, it's like everybody, Grandma and Uncle Joe and everybody came to see me, if we already have a memory of a life on that side. So some people have written in because they're confused about that. Do you have any ideas about that?
The welcoming committee, I think what's happening is that people welcome them permanently. That they know, okay, that people can see us whenever they want to, because they can always contact us via our astral body. Our astral body is always available to them, unlike their body is not available available to us here on the physical level. But when we die and finally transfer all our waking consciousness solidly into the other world, that's a big event to them, because then they have our full divided attention, and then they know we're not going to mourn about it the rest of the time when we're not astrally conscious, you know, that we're missing them and so on. And I think it's that is the thing that takes place. That's why we're celebrating, while they're having a welcoming committee, you know. But it goes even further, because I noticed when you get into a higher state of consciousness, and that has been reported by near-death experiencers, you know, who were, and I think as a result of a sudden shock to the system, that certain chemicals are activated, which catapults these people into a higher state of consciousness.
DMT.
Yeah, and I think they have got basically a peak experience at the moment of death. Yeah. So they get into this higher state of consciousness, and suddenly they have got this clarity, this feeling of heaven. They meet angelic beings, you know, and so very often what can happen when I enter this state of consciousness during meditation, during deep meditation, on a couple of occasions, I have been fully aware, entering into this higher state of consciousness, and suddenly there was a welcoming committee in the form of angels. Okay. Okay, and they were all, and there was quite a large group, you know, welcoming me with song, you know, and it sounds preposterous, but there is actually a celebration taking place when a human being, as human beings, we are normally trapped into our three-dimensional consciousness. When we burst out into the reality of our higher selves, that is a cause for celebration. You know.
And it's the same if somebody is living on the astral plane and they go up to a higher astral plane. I guess this is what you're referring to, right? And then these are sometimes, because there's sometimes discrepancies in the sense people will say, how I don't believe your experiences are real, Cyrus, because I read Michael Newton or some such book, and then people's past life regression shows that they're in like crystal cities and everybody looks like you know, some kind of a non-human form, and it's this completely different environment, and it doesn't sound at all like astral London. So the explanation would be that there's just there's these other gradients of levels that we can probably be in simultaneously, but similar to when we go to the astral level. For the first time we fully connect to that side, then there's attention brought on us and like a welcoming party. And then if we go to a level beyond that, it's also a welcoming party, because now we're fully there. So it's about fully getting to a place.
Yes, and that and when consciousness sort of gets closer, I always call it the home state of consciousness. Our original state, our unity consciousness. That's where we feel most at home. You know, and I always found I knew I get closer to the state of consciousness the more I felt at home, you know. And very often people who have near-death experience, they felt they're coming home and they're missing home and things like that. And that is a very powerful experience, and there is a sort of celebratory aspect to it, you know, because you experience more of your unity consciousness, you know, and you're instinctively drawing other consciousness into your field, you know, and so there is this recognition of unity from other people, and they welcome it. Okay, so you become part of this new club, if you like, but you become conscious of it now. So that is, every time this happens, there is generally an expansion in consciousness generally in mankind, you know, because and that's why I find it's so important that people meditate and try to activate these higher states of consciousness, because that will reflect back to the general consciousness, to the consensus of our human consciousness.
So carrying on from that, but while there are these other gradients that go higher and higher, many people, we do find ourselves in this kind of earthly equivalent. And so something that is interesting to me is the historical ability to be able to find places on that side that are the more authentic version of a place that is here.
Yeah.
So, for example, I was in the capital of Ethiopia a couple of months ago, and the city itself is not that interesting because it's, I mean, it is a lower economic area, but it's not like the city's thousands of years old, and yet there is not really like any architecture, anything that is interesting from dating back to the history of that location. But when I went out of body and I was in the capital of Ethiopia, like it was stone terraces and temples and all types of things that date back easily, you know, to the founding of that society.
Yeah.
And it's this very, very dynamic and beautiful and ancient place,
Yes.
which was really, really interesting to me.
Yes.
And it was very, very much populated by people dating back probably hundreds of years
Yes.
who have been living there. So it was like stepping into the real version of Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and then leaving that state, coming back to the kind of dreary earth plane interpretation. So has this been your experience?
Absolutely. I think the first thing I would say is on the astral plane, reality is more indestructible in lots of ways. It's more permanent. So if you get architectural features from 2000 years ago, which were established with a lot of energy and a lot of sort of positive, celebratory sort of culture, high culture sort of energy, they carry much more power, much more energy, and they are more easily maintained then by the astral inhabitants. You know, so we find structures over there which you can be thousands of years old, and we will find them in their prime state. A little bit like people often report when people die, let's say they're 80 years old or 90, they revert back to their prime state when they were in their 30s, you know. And I think that's true with the astral counterpart of a culture which has been very strong, very energized, that they are maintained much more solidly than they would be here on Earth, you know, where they're subject to cultural changes, war, revolution, you know, and the environmental effects, you know. So I'm not surprised that you've seen it. I've seen it myself.
Yeah, that's, and also you have been able to document historical things by going into kind of Akashic type experiences to get understand how people dressed a certain way and things of that nature as well, right?
Yes, that's the other thing. Of course, you can also go into parallel realities which are recorded in the Akashic records, and by doing so you can actually go back in time, and as we were discussing earlier, it feels just as real, you know, as the astral part you went into, which may be a contemporary establishment, you know, of Addis Ababa, and you can equally go into a period which may be 2,000 years older than that, or 1,000 years younger, you know, because these realities, you know, are existing simultaneously because they are data sets, and you can walk around in these realities, and you can interact with people who decided to stay in these areas, you know, or who visited. You know.
Now, what if somebody, for example, I was mentioning Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, maybe there's a 1,000-year-old emperor from that realm. How is it that we would still see them there if they have moved on into these higher realms of existence above the earthly astral? Is it possible for them to come back to that prior place to be able to address the people that, you know, they know, or that they have some kind of status in that environment, or are they permanently moved beyond that type of realm? Can people move?
But that's a really interesting thing. I think that's where I have to agree with Tom Campbell, you know, that Tom Campbell sees things as a virtual reality. For example, this 1,000-year-old emperor, whose higher self may be not in direct contact with it, This is really something I'm still trying to work out. It's so complicated, because at one stage I thought, what's happening with all these different realities? How can you possibly best understand it? How can you put it into a mind frame which makes it plausible to exist simultaneously as well as concurrently, you know? And so one of the pictures that came to my mind was that of a sponge, where every bubble in the sponge is a reality which can sit next, side by side, you know. And I'm working on this, you know, and I'm going to investigate it and see how it actually. I don't know. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, I think that if somebody is on a higher, so-called higher plane, especially when we go into, because I don't just use out-of-body work to understand this side. I listen to physical mediums, Leslie Flint, proper channeled material, Silver Birch, these types of sources. So, like, what I do is I put it all together and find, for the most part, it's all consistent if it's good material. So, I think that if you've ascended into a plane above or beyond the normal astral plane, I don't think there's anything stopping somebody from coming back to that, if you want to call it lower or just denser environment, or be in both places at the same time. So, but I think what is not possible is to go from that lower environment to be able to go higher if you're not psychically ready to be able to do that yet, right? So, so it's like you can go from the top and come back, but you can't from the bottom and go up unless you're able to achieve that ability.
Yes, I had one experience which was very profound, where I went, an out-of-body experience. I went into a past life where I was walking along in a night sort of uniform after we just came back from a raid. And I was trudging through the mud, and I was suddenly observing my coat. I studied the buttons on it, and I suddenly took total awareness of where I was in the past life and things like that. And I took note of the person trudging through the mud, that he was slightly depressed and didn't know what, you know, and he was quite miserable. But he was not aware that I was actually observing him. He was not aware of my higher self, let's say, of my out-of-body state, observing him. So I couldn't influence him either. I couldn't say, oh, look, you to go do this way or that way, you know. That wasn't possible. There was no communication between the two of us. So there was basically three of us. It was me lying in bed, me in my out-of-body state, and me in a past life.
So with all of our experiences, and you of course have about 40 years more experience, I think, than me, or 30 years or something like this, more than I've been doing. So you're much more experienced than I am. But together, hopefully, I think that the most important thing, regardless, is being able to bring information out to people.
Yes.
And what would you like to see in terms of society growing or evolving in this way? And what can we do, or what can people watching do to get more information out to people who maybe could really benefit from knowing these things because they're depressed, or they have things where, if they just had access to some of this information, maybe they wouldn't be depressed, they wouldn't have that.
Yes. Well, I would say the first thing to realize is that everything is just an experience. Everything is an experience, and what we experience now is only the beginning of an infinite future ahead of us. You know, there's no such thing as death. You know, all we're doing at the moment, whether we are sick or whether we're even mortally sick and only have a few weeks or a few months to live, we should just sort of not be too hung up about it. Just experience it as an experience, and it's in order to deal with our anxieties about our current circumstances and our life, we should just accept the moment, the present moment we're living it, and enjoy it, and just see the experiences we're going through just as an experience which will pass, which we need to learn from, and instead discover the joy of the moment. And to me, the joy of the moment is always very, very present, you know. And once you know that I always like to say the bedrock of reality is bliss. Once you get to the basics of reality, which you find in the moment, you will actually find that life is very beautiful.
Yeah, and also I think as well for people who might watch something like this and they can't imagine this connected to their own reality because they've never had an experience, my recommendation is to pay close attention to your dreams, because sometimes a dream is a gateway to these experiences or to a life you might be leading on that side, but you're incorrectly dismissing it as dreams when you're really getting information. And so that could be a key to the puzzle to understand where you will be or the life you'll be leading after you cross over. Do you have any suggestions as well?
I absolutely agree. I think dreams are nature's way of telling us we have a much bigger life. You know, nature is providing us a very natural way to go into our higher dimensional lives, you know, which we experience, but we are not aware of, which we are too ready to dismiss as a dream. But it's much more to it than just a dream.
So we could probably talk all night about these subjects. We've talked about a lot of really interesting things when the cameras were not rolling. Unfortunately, those conversations only exist in the Akashic record now. So if anybody wants to access them, you can at home. Using your own mind, you can come in and see what we've talked. But it might be a little bit difficult to do. So I do want to say it's great to be here, and for you guys watching, if you enjoyed this conversation with Jurgen, definitely grab some of his books like Multidimensional Man, Vistas of Infinity, or The 10-Minute Moment. Maybe some future books coming out, Jurgen?
Who knows?
Who knows? Maybe from me as well. Who knows? And as well, I encourage you to please go down and hit that subscribe button and like this video, share the video, because this helps get the message out there. Or you can also sign up as a patron over at patreon.com/Afterlife Topics or Afterlife University. These are chances to get involved and be able to talk to guests, sometimes via Zoom or other methods, and ask them questions. I might get Jurgen on there again sometime to talk to us digitally and things like that, and help support this work. So with that being said, I guess we'll talk to you guys real soon, and keep practicing those consciousness states, and keep learning about this subject, because it affects all of us. That's always what I say also in my books, because nobody gets out of here alive, in the words of Morrison. So we best learn about this stuff, because it affects everybody.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So.